I am Chloe, 35 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful software developer, I escaped their toxicity but maintained occasional contact. Last Sunday, they invited me to an upscale brunch to catch up. Between mimosas and avocado toast, my mother leaned forward, smirking. "You know, Chloe, you are lucky we even include you. Pity goes a long way." I simply sipped my coffee and smiled. That night, I logged in, disabled every family credit account, and emailed my lawyer about selling the cabin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Fairfield, Connecticut meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our four-bedroom house with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom, painted pale blue, at my mother Elaine's insistence, despite my preference for green, became my sanctuary and prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight A's, joined honor societies, and pushed myself to the brink of exhaustion just to be seen. But the truth was, Elaine only cared about appearances, and my dark skin and quiet demeanor never fit her country club aesthetic. I thought moving to Atlanta and building my tech startup would sever those chains. I thought I had finally found my real family when I met Julian. He was charismatic, brilliant, and pursuing his medical degree. I believed in his dream so much I financed it, $170,000 to ensure he could study without loans. I thought I was investing in our future. I was actually funding my own public execution. The grand finale of his deception happened in the Ritz-Carlton ballroom. The graduation party was extravagant, paid for entirely by my corporate card. Chandeliers cast a golden glow over tables adorned with white roses. The room was packed with seasoned surgeons and church leaders. I wore an emerald gown, feeling pride as I watched Julian mingle in his tuxedo. He was finally a doctor. Our sacrifices had paid off. I picked up a glass of champagne and tapped a silver spoon against the rim. The cheerful chatter settled down as I approached the microphone set up on the grand stage. I smiled at Julian, ready to deliver a toast to the man I was going to marry. But as I reached for the stand, Julian stepped in front of me. His face was completely devoid of the warmth I had known for 4 years. He snatched the microphone right out of my hand. The heavy thud echoed through the silent ballroom. I stood there frozen, expecting a joke. Instead, Julian reached into the front row and grabbed the hand of Sydney. Sydney was the daughter of the chief of surgery at the hospital where Julian was beginning his residency. She was everything his mother valued: generational wealth and undeniably arrogant. Julian pulled her onto the stage and wrapped his arm tightly around her waist. He kissed her cheek right in front of me. The crowd gasped softly. Julian looked dead into my eyes, raised the microphone, and addressed the room. He pointed a sharp finger at the security guards by the mahogany double doors. "Remove her," he commanded, his voice booming. "She is just an obsessive former roommate who will not let go." My breath caught in my throat. The words hit me like physical blows. Former roommate. Obsessive. I looked around the room, searching for someone to intervene. My eyes found his family. His sister Tasha and her husband Darnell were sitting at the VIP table, snickering behind their napkins. But the most brutal reaction came from Julian's mother, Brenda. Brenda was a woman who weaponized scripture to judge everyone she deemed beneath her. As two massive security guards marched toward the stage, I tried to step down to confront Julian privately. Brenda deliberately stepped into the aisle, blocking my path entirely. She was wearing a sparkling silver gown I had purchased for her 2 weeks prior. She took a slow sip of her champagne and smirked. "Did you think paying a few tuition bills would buy you a surgeon's sweetheart?" Brenda whispered, keeping her voice low so the doctors could not hear. "You do not have the pedigree for this family. You never did. Look at you. You build the foundation. But Sydney is the prize that gets to live in the house. Know your place and leave before you embarrass yourself further." I stared at Brenda, taking in her sheer cruelty. For 4 years I hosted her holidays and endured her backhanded compliments about my complexion. I did it because I loved her son. But staring at the sneer on Brenda's face, the veil completely lifted. The humiliation they expected me to feel evaporated. It was instantly replaced by an icy, absolute clarity. The security guards reached me, grabbing my arms with heavy hands. "Ma'am, we need you to exit the premises immediately," the taller guard said, attempting to tug me toward the doors. I did not struggle or cry. I did not give them the dramatic spectacle they were practically salivating to witness. Instead, I stood my ground for a brief moment, easily shaking off the guard's grip. I smoothed down the fabric of my emerald dress, maintaining perfect eye contact with Brenda. Then I shifted my gaze to Darnell, who was busy trying to record my humiliation on his phone. Darnell was an entrepreneur whose businesses constantly filed for bankruptcy. I raised my voice just enough to cut through the murmurs of the wealthy guests. "Darnell," I called out, my tone sickeningly sweet. "Congratulations on your logistics company surviving its first quarter. I am sure it has nothing to do with me paying your American Express bill every month so your cars are not repossessed. Have a great time tonight because your card declines at midnight." Darnell's phone dropped slightly, the smug grin wiping right off his face. Tasha stopped laughing, her eyes darting between her husband and me in sudden panic. I turned my attention back to Brenda. She was glaring at me, furious I had dared to speak out of turn. I slowly slid the heavy engagement ring off my finger. Julian had presented it, calling it a priceless family heirloom. I dropped the ring into Brenda's champagne. It sank to the bottom of the flute. "Keep your cubic zirconia, Brenda." I smiled. "The fake stone matches your fake faith perfectly. Have a wonderful evening, everyone." I turned around and walked down the center aisle with my head held high. The security guards trailed behind me. The silence was deafening, save for my heels against the polished marble. Julian shouted angrily from the stage, trying to regain his bewildered audience. "I do not care what you say," Julian yelled. "I am keeping the penthouse. Do not come back tonight. The locks are already being changed." I did not look back. I pushed open the doors and stepped into the night. The valet brought my car around, but I waved him off and summoned an Uber Black instead. I needed the quiet to execute my plan. Inside the car, the driver asked if I was okay. I told him I had never been better. I pulled my phone out of my clutch. My hands were perfectly steady. I ignored the frantic text from Tasha demanding to know if I was serious about the credit cards. A moment later, an angry voicemail from Julian appeared on my screen demanding I answer him immediately. He sounded so incredibly confident, so thoroughly convinced that he was the one in control of the situation. I listened to his voice echo in the quiet space of the car, and I felt nothing but a profound sense of peace. I had spent years trying to prove my worth to a family that was committed to misunderstanding me. I had bent over backwards to accommodate their constant demands, paying for their lavish lifestyles while they mocked my career and my dark skin. They assumed my silence was weakness. They assumed I would just quietly walk away, utterly destroyed and broken. Instead, I opened a secure folder labeled LLC Asset Liquidation. Julian and his family thought I was a lonely woman who wrote a check out of devotion. They thought they had used my money and discarded me the moment I was no longer useful to their climb. What they failed to understand was that I was a senior financial auditor specializing in risk management. I never gave Julian a dime out of the goodness of my heart. I gave him a commercial loan, and the penalty for fraud was immediate total financial ruin. Tomorrow, Dr. Julian would learn exactly who owned his life. The morning sun had barely crested the Atlanta skyline when the private elevator chimed and opened directly into my penthouse. I stepped out holding a fresh cup of coffee, completely prepared for the war I was about to wage. The sight that greeted me was a masterclass in audacity. My living room, a meticulously curated space of white leather and modern glass, looked like a ransacked storage unit. Heavy-duty black trash bags were strewn across the imported rug. Standing in the middle of my living room was Julian, wearing a designer tracksuit I had purchased for his birthday. Beside him were his sister Tasha and her husband Darnell. They were actively shoving my custom-tailored suits and silk dresses into the garbage bags, like they were clearing out a thrift store donation bin. Julian looked up as the elevator doors closed behind me. He did not look surprised. He looked incredibly smug. He walked over to the marble kitchen island, picked up a crisp white document, and held it out toward me. "You are trespassing, Chloe?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I suggest you turn around and get back in that elevator before I have you arrested." I walked slowly into the room, ignoring the paper he was holding out. I looked at Tasha, who was holding one of my expensive handbags, clearly debating whether to pack it or steal it. "What exactly is going on here?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. Julian slapped the document onto the marble counter. "It is an emergency restraining order," he declared proudly. "I filed it online at 4 in the morning. I detailed your emotionally unstable behavior at my graduation party. I explained to the magistrate that you are a jealous, unhinged ex-fiancé who made a public scene and threatened my safety, since my name is on the utility bills. The apartment stays with me while you cool off. Grab your trash bags and leave." I looked at the document. It was a temporary filing completely unverified by a judge, simply printed from a legal aid website. He truly believed his new medical degree made him invincible. Darnell chuckled from the corner of the room, tossing a pair of my heels into a bag. "You heard the doctor," Darnell sneered. "You played yourself last night, Chloe. You thought you could embarrass us in front of the whole hospital board, but you just proved you are crazy. Now you are out on the street." Before I could address Darnell, Tasha pulled her phone out of her pocket, her eyes gleaming with malicious joy. "You should see what Mom posted in the Greater Zion Church Facebook group this morning," Tasha said, swiping on her screen. "The whole congregation is talking about you. It already has 200 comments." She cleared her throat and began reading aloud with exaggerated theatricality. "To my beloved church family," Tasha read, mimicking Brenda's dramatic tone. "It is with a heavy heart that I ask for prayers for my son, Dr. Julian. Last night, his former roommate and ex-fiancée, Chloe, attempted to ruin his graduation with a horrific jealous outburst. We welcomed this troubled young woman into our family, trying to show her the grace of God. But her dark, bitter spirit could not handle Julian finding a woman of true class and pedigree. She is a manipulative gold digger who tried to claim credit for his hard work. Please pray for her mental health as Julian moves forward with his beautiful new bride, Sydney." Tasha locked her phone and smiled at me. "Deaconess Martha commented that you always had a sneaky look about you," Tasha laughed. "The whole city knows you are crazy, Chloe. You have no man, no apartment, and no reputation." I stood there letting their cruel laughter fill the vast space of the penthouse. They were completely intoxicated by their perceived victory. They genuinely believed that because Brenda had the church on her side and Julian had a hospital badge, I was powerless. They thought I was just a heartbroken woman who could be easily bullied out of her own home. I placed my coffee cup down on the marble island. I did not argue. I did not yell. I simply pulled my phone from my pocket and opened my secure smart home application. "Julian," I said softly, "did you ever wonder why the utility bills are in your name, but you never once saw the actual lease agreement?" Julian frowned, crossing his arms. "Because you handled the paperwork. It does not matter. Tenancy rights in Georgia protect me. I live here." I tapped a single red icon on my screen labeled Security Lockdown. Instantly, the heavy electronic deadbolts on the front door and the elevator access slammed shut with a loud mechanical clank. The motorized blackout shades on the floor-to-ceiling windows swiftly descended, plunging the bright room into shadows. A high-pitched security alarm began to chirp rhythmically from the ceiling speakers, signaling a perimeter breach. "What did you just do?" Julian demanded, his smug demeanor faltering. "I just triggered the intruder protocol," I replied calmly. Tasha dropped my handbag, looking around nervously as the red security lights began flashing along the baseboards. "Unlock that door right now," Darnell shouted, taking a step toward me. "You called the police to enforce your fake restraining order, did you not?" I asked Julian. "Yes," Julian snapped, pulling out his phone. "And I am calling them again right now to tell them you are holding us hostage. You are going to jail, Chloe. This is kidnapping." I walked over to the plush white sofa, sat down, and crossed my legs. "Please do," I said. "Tell them to hurry." For the next 10 minutes, Julian paced the floor shouting into his phone to the emergency dispatcher claiming his crazy ex-girlfriend had trapped him in his own apartment. Tasha and Darnell stood awkwardly by the trash bags, their earlier arrogance replaced by creeping anxiety. The loud banging on the heavy oak front door finally interrupted Julian's pacing. "Atlanta police," a deep voice shouted from the hallway. "Open the door immediately." I tapped my phone screen again. The deadbolts retracted and the door swung open. 4 police officers rushed into the room, hands resting on their utility belts. Julian immediately ran toward them, pointing frantically at me. "Officers, thank God you are here!" Julian cried out, playing the perfect victim. "I am Dr. Julian. This is my apartment. I have an emergency restraining order against this woman. She broke in, changed the locks electronically, and tried to trap us in here. She is completely unstable. You need to arrest her and remove her from my property." The lead officer, a tall man with a stern expression, held up his hand to stop Julian's rant. He looked at the trash bags, then looked at me sitting calmly on the sofa. "Ma'am," the officer said cautiously, "step away from the phone and explain what is going on here." I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and walked over to the kitchen island. I bypassed Julian entirely and handed the lead officer a thick blue folder I had brought up with me. "Good morning, officer," I said clearly. "My name is Chloe. You will find my identification, the official property deed, and the corporate ownership documents in that folder." Julian scoffed loudly. "She is lying. She rents this place. Look at the utility bills. I pay the electric." The officer opened the folder and reviewed the documents. He flipped through the thick stack of papers, his eyes scanning the notarized seals and state certifications. The penthouse was not rented. It was owned free and clear by Apex Financial Holdings, LLC. And the sole managing director of Apex Financial Holdings was me. Furthermore, I had included a copy of the occupancy agreement Julian had signed 4 years ago, which clearly stated he was a guest of the owner and could be removed at any time without notice, waiving all tenancy rights. The officer closed the folder and handed it back to me with a respectful nod. Then he turned his attention to Julian. "Sir," the officer said, his tone entirely shifted. "The document she just provided proves she owns this entire property. Your name is nowhere on the deed or the corporate filing." "That is impossible," Julian yelled, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. "I live here. I have a restraining order. I showed it to you." The officer pulled Julian's printed paper from the counter and glanced at it. "This is an unfiled online template, sir. It has no judge's signature. It is completely worthless. Right now, the only thing happening here is that you and your friends are trespassing on private property, and the owner wants you gone." Tasha gasped, grabbing Darnell's arm. "Wait, she owns this place." Tasha whispered loudly, staring at me in absolute horror. "You have exactly 2 minutes to vacate the premises," the lead officer instructed Julian, gesturing toward the open door. "Or I will arrest all 3 of you for criminal trespassing and attempted burglary, considering you have her expensive property stuffed into garbage bags." "I am a doctor!" Julian screamed, the veins in his neck bulging. "You cannot treat me like a common criminal." "I need to pack my things. My shoes are in the bedroom." "You have 1 minute and 45 seconds, the officer replied coldly, stepping toward Julian with his hand resting on his handcuffs. "Move. Now." The sheer panic finally set in. Darnell did not wait for another warning. He bolted for the door, leaving Tasha behind. Tasha scrambled after him, practically tripping over the trash bags in her rush to escape the police. Julian stood frozen, staring at me with a mixture of absolute hatred and disbelief. He was wearing nothing but his designer tracksuit and a pair of white socks. "Time is up," the second officer said, grabbing Julian by the arm and physically turning him toward the doorway. Julian stumbled forward, his socks slipping slightly on the hardwood floor. As the police escorted him out into the harsh fluorescent light of the public hallway, Julian ripped his arm away from the officer. He turned back to look at me, his chest heaving. "You think you won?" he scoffed, trying to salvage his shattered pride in front of the cops. "Keep the damn apartment. I start my surgical residency on Monday, making real money. I am marrying into the chief of surgery's family. I will buy a mansion twice this size, and you will still be a lonely, bitter woman holding onto a piece of paper." I walked over to the doorway and leaned against the frame. I looked down at his socked feet, then met his furious eyes. I gave him a slow, chilling smirk. "Buy a mansion, Julian," I replied softly. "Just make sure you can walk there, because you might want to check on that Mercedes G-Wagon you parked downstairs." I hit the button on the wall panel. The heavy oak door slammed shut directly in his face, followed by the satisfying click of the electronic deadbolt locking him out of my life forever. The weekend passed in a state of quiet, calculating preparation. I knew Julian. I knew that after the initial shock of being evicted wore off, his massive ego would kick back in. He would convince himself that the penthouse was just a minor setback. After all, Monday was orientation day at Atlanta General Hospital. In his mind, the moment he put on his white coat, he would become untouchable. He believed the prestige of his new title would shield him from the consequences of his actions. He was about to learn that a medical degree does not pay the bills and a white coat cannot hide a fraud. Monday morning arrived with crisp, clear skies. I parked my rental car across the street from the hospital's exclusive VIP doctor's parking lot and waited. Right on schedule, the roar of a twin-turbo engine broke the morning quiet. Julian pulled into the lot behind the wheel of a matte black Mercedes G-Wagon. It was a spectacular vehicle, aggressive and luxurious, with a sticker price of $160,000. I had leased it through my holding company a year ago as a graduation gift, allowing him to drive it as long as he maintained the terms of our financial agreement. Now it was just another asset ready to be liquidated. Through my binoculars, I watched Julian step out of the driver's side. He was dressed in a sharp navy suit, looking every bit the part of the elite medical professional. Sydney was waiting for him near the entrance, looking radiant in a designer trench coat. She rushed over and threw her arms around him. A moment later, they were joined by a tall, distinguished-looking man with silver hair. This was Dr. Richard Sterling, the chief of surgery at Atlanta General, and more importantly, Sydney's father. Julian leaned against the grille of the G-Wagon, gesturing broadly as he spoke to Dr. Sterling. Even from a distance, I could read his body language. He was selling the image of black excellence and generational wealth. He was playing the role of the refined, affluent young doctor who was a perfect match for the chief of surgery's daughter. He casually patted the hood of the Mercedes, undoubtedly claiming it as a symbol of his hard work and financial acumen. Dr. Sterling nodded approvingly, clapping Julian on the shoulder. It was a perfect picture-ready moment of high society triumph. It was time to ruin it. I signaled the heavy-duty commercial tow truck waiting in the alley beside me. The massive diesel engine rumbled to life, and the truck pulled out into the street, heading straight for the VIP lot. I walked closely behind it, my heels clicking rhythmically against the pavement. The truck's reverse alarm began to blare with a loud, piercing beep that echoed across the quiet parking area. Heads turned. Nurses attending physicians and administrative staff paused on the sidewalks to see what the commotion was about. The tow truck backed into the VIP space directly in front of the G-Wagon. The operator, a burly man named Marcus, whom I had hired specifically for his no-nonsense attitude, hopped out and immediately began unspooling the heavy steel cables. He did not hesitate. He slid the towing forks right under the front tires of the Mercedes. By the hospital entrance, Julian finally realized what was happening. The smug smile vanished from his face, replaced by sheer panic. He abandoned Sydney and her father sprinting across the parking lot, with his suit jacket flapping behind him. "Hey!" Julian screamed, waving his arms frantically. "Hey, stop right there! What do you think you are doing? That is my car. Get your hands off my vehicle." Marcus did not even look up. He continued ratcheting the straps over the tires, locking them into place. Julian reached the truck, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He lunged toward Marcus, but I stepped out from behind the tow truck, blocking his path. I was wearing a tailored crimson suit, looking completely out of place in a hospital parking lot, but perfectly dressed for a corporate execution. "Good morning, Julian," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the mechanical sounds of the tow winch. "Happy orientation day." Julian stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes darted nervously toward the hospital entrance, where Dr. Sterling and Sydney were now walking briskly toward us, their expressions tight with confusion and concern. "Chloe, what is wrong with you?" Julian hissed, lowering his voice in a desperate attempt to contain the scene. "You evicted me." "Fine. But you are not taking my car. I need this to get to work. You are making a scene in front of my boss. Tell this guy to drop the car right now or I am calling the police. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a crisp, notarized document. I held it up so anyone watching could see it clearly. You cannot call the police to report the legal repossession of a vehicle you do not own, Julian, I replied, speaking loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear. This is the lease agreement for the Mercedes. You will notice that the lessee is Apex Financial Holdings, LLC, my company. You are merely listed as an authorized driver. And as of 8 o'clock this morning, that authorization has been permanently revoked due to breach of contract. Julian stared at the paperwork, his jaw tight. You gave this to me? He muttered through clenched teeth. It was a gift. I gave you the privilege of driving it, I corrected him smoothly. A privilege you lost when you filed a fraudulent legal document against me to steal my home. Now the holding company is liquidating the asset. Dr. Sterling and Sydney finally reached us. Sydney looked mortified, staring at the tow truck as it lifted the front end of the luxury SUV into the air. Julian, what is going on here? Dr. Sterling demanded, his authoritative voice cutting through the tension. Why is your car being towed on your first day? And who is this woman? Julian scrambled for an excuse, his professional facade crumbling entirely. Sir, it is a misunderstanding. She is my ex-girlfriend. She is just bitter and trying to cause trouble because we broke up. I missed one payment because of a bank error and she overreacted. A bank error? I repeated, letting out a sharp, genuine laugh. Dr. Sterling, your future son-in-law has never made a single payment on this vehicle. He does not have the credit score to finance a used Honda, let alone a $160,000 Mercedes. I pay the lease, I pay the insurance, I even pay for the premium gas in the tank. Sydney gasped, covering her mouth. Julian turned on me, his eyes blazing with a feral kind of hatred. Shut up, he yelled, losing his temper completely. Just shut your mouth, Chloe. You are insane. I ignored his outburst. I walked over to the rear of the Mercedes and pressed the electronic trunk release on my spare key fob. The heavy rear door swung open. Inside was Julian's expensive leather gym bag, the one he carried to the hospital every day to look the part of a fitness-conscious surgeon. I grabbed it by the handles and tossed it unceremoniously onto the asphalt. It hit the ground with a dull thud, tumbling open to spill his pristine white sneakers and a brand-new stethoscope onto the dirty parking lot floor. Make sure you get all your personal items. Doctor, I said cheerfully, because the vehicle is going to the impound lot and I highly doubt you can afford the retrieval fee. As Julian knelt on the ground in his expensive suit to gather his spilled belongings, my cell phone began to ring loudly. The caller ID flashed on the screen. It was Darnell. The timing was absolutely flawless. I swiped to answer and put the call on speakerphone, holding it up so the audio would project clearly into the tense air of the parking lot. Chloe? Darnell's voice blasted through the speaker, high-pitched and frantic. Chloe, what did you do? I am sitting at a breakfast meeting with the regional supply vendors for my logistics company. I just tried to pay the deposit invoice and my American Express declined. I smiled, keeping my eyes fixed on Julian, who was slowly standing up, clutching his stethoscope. Is that right, Darnell? I asked innocently. Yes, Darnell shouted, his panic escalating. So I handed them the Visa. Declined. I handed them the MasterCard. Declined. The vendor is sitting right across from me, looking at me like I am a scammer. I called the bank, and they said the primary account holder closed the accounts. You need to unlock these cards right now. My entire business is going to fold today if I cannot pay this invoice. I took a slow, deep breath, relishing the moment. Darnell, I said calmly, making sure every word was crystal clear for the audience around me. Those are corporate credit cards belonging to my firm. You, your wife Tasha, and your mother-in-law Brenda were added as authorized users 2 years ago as a temporary favor to help you build credit. You have spent the last 24 months leeching off my finances, buying designer clothes, funding failing business ventures, and living a lifestyle you absolutely cannot afford. There was dead silence on the other end of the line. Even the hospital staff watching the spectacle had gone completely quiet. The free ride is officially over, Darnell, I continued. You are a 36-year-old man. It is time to pay your own bills. Good luck with your vendors. I tapped the screen, ending the call, and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I turned back to Julian. He looked physically sick. The illusion of his immense wealth and success had been completely dismantled in less than 5 minutes, right in front of his new boss, his new fiancé, and his new colleagues. The tow truck driver secured the final safety chains, climbed into the cab, and put the truck in gear. The Mercedes G-Wagon was pulled slowly out of the VIP lot, leaving an empty parking space and a shattered ego in its wake. Dr. Sterling took a step toward me. His face was a mask of cold fury. He was a man used to absolute control, and he did not appreciate his hospital being turned into a theater for my revenge. Listen to me very carefully, young woman, Dr. Sterling said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. I do not care what personal vendetta you have against Julian. You do not come to my hospital, disrupt my staff, and humiliate one of my residents on his first day. You have made a very serious mistake. I sit on the board of directors for half the financial institutions in this city. I will personally make sure your career is ruined for this stunt. I looked Dr. Sterling directly in the eyes. I was not intimidated by his threats. I dealt with powerful, angry men in corporate boardrooms every single day. Dr. Sterling, I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of fear. Before you threaten to destroy my career, you might want to spend a little more time looking into the man you are about to welcome into your family. Dr. Sterling narrowed his eyes. What is that supposed to mean? He demanded. I adjusted my briefcase strap on my shoulder and gave him a final chilling smile. It means that a repossessed car and a canceled credit card are the absolute least of Julian's problems right now. If I were you, I would run a full federal background check on your future son-in-law before you let him anywhere near your patients or your daughter's bank accounts. Have a wonderful orientation day. Gentlemen, I did not wait for Dr. Sterling to formulate a response. I simply turned on my heel and walked back to my rental car, leaving the chief of surgery standing in the middle of the parking lot with his daughter and a humiliated resident who was currently clutching his brand-new stethoscope like a lifeline. I drove straight to the sleek glass high-rise in downtown Atlanta that housed my forensic accounting firm. By the time I swiped my security badge at the front desk, the retaliation had already begun. Dr. Sterling was a powerful man who moved quickly when his absolute authority was publicly challenged. As soon as I stepped off the elevator onto the executive floor, my assistant immediately handed me a pink message slip. Managing partner David Reynolds wanted to see me in his corner office immediately. I walked to my desk and calmly reviewed my emails. There was a frantic message from Julian begging me to answer my phone. I deleted it without reading the rest. I knew exactly what David Reynolds wanted to discuss. Dr. Sterling had used his extensive network to bypass standard corporate channels, reaching directly to the top of my firm. Sterling served on this board of directors for 3 major financial institutions that were significant clients of our accounting firm. He was attempting to leverage that lucrative relationship to crush me. He had undoubtedly painted a colorful picture of a hysterical ex-girlfriend harassing his staff and disrupting his hospital. He fully expected David to fire me on the spot. Sterling severely underestimated me. He assumed I was just a mid-level employee who could be easily discarded to preserve peace. He did not realize that I was the lead forensic auditor who had saved this firm over $40 million in liability exposure just last quarter. More importantly, he did not realize that I never walked into a corporate battle unprepared. I picked up my desk phone and dialed the internal extension for Marcus Vance. Marcus was the most ruthless corporate litigator in our entire legal department. Marcus, I said, when he answered his phone, I need you to accompany me to David's office right now. We are having a sudden meeting about my employment status, and I absolutely want legal counsel present. 5 minutes later, Marcus and I walked into the sprawling corner office of the managing partner. David Reynolds was standing behind his massive mahogany desk, looking deeply uncomfortable and stressed. He gestured for us to sit down. Chloe. David began slowly lacing his fingers together. I just received a very disturbing phone call from Dr. Richard Sterling at Atlanta General Hospital. He claims you showed up at his workplace this morning, caused a massive public scene, and harassed one of his new surgical residents. He is demanding your immediate termination, citing professional misconduct and highly unstable behavior. He directly threatened to pull his banking clients from our firm if I do not comply immediately. I sat perfectly straight in my leather chair. David, I replied, keeping my tone strictly professional. Dr. Sterling is operating under false information fed to him by a desperate con artist. I was not at the hospital to harass anyone today. I was there executing a lawful asset recovery operation on behalf of Apex Financial Holdings LLC. Marcus placed a thick bound portfolio onto David's desk and slid it forward so he could read it. Let me completely clarify the situation for everyone. I continued, leaning slightly forward. For the past 4 years, my ex-fiancé Julian has been telling everyone that I generously paid for his medical school tuition out of the goodness of my heart. His entire family falsely believes I was simply a sweet, devoted girlfriend who willingly handed over $170,000 with zero strings attached. That narrative is a complete fabrication. When Julian and I initially met, his credit score was hovering in the very low 500s. He had already defaulted on multiple undergraduate loans and could not possibly secure a single penny of federal or private funding for his medical school education. His ultimate dream of becoming a surgeon was completely dead. I opened the leather portfolio on David's desk directly to the first tab. I did not give Julian a generous personal gift. I am a senior forensic risk auditor. I meticulously assess financial liability for a living. I formally created a limited liability company named Apex Financial, and I officially originated a commercial student loan specifically for Julian. He signed a legally binding contract explicitly agreeing to a 9% annual interest rate securely backed by strict repayment terms. I solely funded his entire medical education through my separate corporate entity, not my private personal checking account. The aggressive repossession of the luxury Mercedes this morning was simply a standard lawful seizure of collateral strictly due to a catastrophic breach of that specific contract. David stared closely at the documents, his eyes widening significantly as he read through the immaculate legal phrasing of the commercial loan agreement. You actually treated your own romantic relationship exactly like a corporate merger, David whispered, a clear hint of awe bleeding through his initial professional concern. I treat my hard-earned capital with the utmost respect it truly deserves, I calmly corrected him. Julian foolishly assumed that simply because we shared a bed, my money was automatically his money. He fundamentally misunderstood the rigid architecture of our ongoing financial arrangement. But the public repossession of the vehicle is genuinely just the beginning. I turned to the second tab in the portfolio. Let us deeply discuss the morality clause. Section 4, paragraph B of the commercial loan agreement explicitly dictates the exact terms of an immediate default. Standard loans generally default solely due to consecutively missed payments. My loan was intelligently structured with a very specific fraud and moral turpitude trigger. If the borrower engages in any fraudulent legal activity, criminal behavior, or actions that deliberately harm the professional reputation and financial standing of the lender, the entire loan instantly defaults. Marcus leaned in smoothly, taking over the detailed legal explanation for David. Yesterday morning, the borrower Julian officially filed a fabricated emergency restraining order against Chloe. He brazenly lied to a magistrate judge, falsely claiming Chloe was emotionally unstable and physically threatening solely to illegally evict her from a luxury property she rightfully owns and forcefully seize control of the primary residence. He then manipulatively called the Atlanta Police Department to strictly enforce this utterly fraudulent document. Filing a completely false police report and actively forging legitimate grounds for a restraining order constitute undeniable federal fraud and severe moral turpitude. I looked David squarely in the eyes. Because Julian arrogantly triggered the morality clause, the standard structured repayment schedule has been completely nullified. The entire outstanding principal balance of $170,000 is now legally due immediately. Furthermore, the original contract outlines a very severe financial penalty for a moral default, accurately factoring in the heavily capitalized interest and the punitive default fees. Julian currently owes Apex Financial Holdings exactly $220,000, payable fully today. David sat back heavily in his luxurious leather chair, entirely speechless. The aggressive threat from Dr. Sterling was suddenly completely irrelevant. I was not a crazy, hysterical ex-girlfriend foolishly throwing a public tantrum. I was a legitimate corporate entity flawlessly executing a devastatingly legal and binding debt collection. If Dr. Sterling unlawfully attempted to aggressively interfere with my employment over this precise matter, he would absolutely be opening himself and his esteemed hospital up to a massive corporate interference lawsuit. Chloe? David finally said, slowly clearing his dry throat. What exactly is your next strategic move here? Sterling is anxiously expecting a phone call back from me confirming your immediate termination. You can politely tell Dr. Sterling that you reviewed the matter and determined it is an active legal dispute regarding standard corporate debt collection, and the firm will not be taking any disciplinary action, I instructed incredibly calmly. If he fiercely pushes back kindly, remind him that knowingly harboring a surgical resident who actively commits blatant perjury and real estate fraud might severely violate his own hospital's strict ethics board policies. Marcus nodded in total agreement. The firm is completely insulated, David. Chloe's legal documentation is entirely bulletproof. Terminating her would clearly be wrongful dismissal, and we would absolutely be defending it fiercely in court. Dr. Sterling has absolutely no real leverage here. David let out a long, relieved breath, a slow, genuine smile finally breaking through his deeply tense expression. He quickly closed the portfolio and handed it straight back to Marcus. Well, he softly murmured, I certainly pity anyone who ever tries to cross you, Chloe. You are officially cleared to confidently return to your desk. Please handle your business, but keep the firm's good name completely out of the collateral damage. I thanked David, gracefully stood up and walked out of the office with Marcus. I had successfully neutralized the chief of surgery's attack before it even gained momentum. Julian had played his best card using his new father-in-law's influence, and it had failed spectacularly. Now it was my turn to firmly return fire. I returned to my desk and unlocked my screen. I opened my secure client and drafted a new message. This was not going to be quiet or private. Julian had humiliatingly discarded me publicly at graduation. I attached the official debt notice demanding immediate payment of $220,000. I attached the penthouse police report proving the fraudulent order and the signed morality clause. I typed his hospital email into the recipient line. Then I added Human Resources, the residency director, and Dr. Sterling's direct email to carbon copy. I clicked send. The email vanished, speeding to detonate his life. He was probably sitting comfortably in his new plush orientation seminar, right now completely oblivious to the undeniable fact that a massive financial guillotine was rapidly dropping directly onto his exposed neck. The illusion of his perfect elite existence was officially over forever starting this very exact second. The fallout from my email was instantaneous and spectacular. Within 20 minutes of hitting send, Julian's phone began ringing frantically. I knew this because my legal team was already receiving panicked voicemails from his newly hired, deeply out-of-his-depth defense attorney. Julian had spent his entire morning orientation seminar sitting in a plush leather chair, believing he had outsmarted me. But the moment his phone buzzed with the notification of a $220,000 debt collection explicitly copied to the chief of surgery and the hospital human resources department, his arrogant facade completely shattered. He realized with horrifying clarity that I had not just threatened him, I had legally bound him. He was completely screwed. He desperately needed a high-powered corporate lawyer to fight the apex predator he had carelessly awakened, and high-powered lawyers required massive retainers. In his absolute desperation, Julian turned to the only people he thought still had any financial leverage. He called his sister Tasha and her husband Darnell. According to the furious text messages Julian accidentally sent to my old shared calendar, he begged Darnell for a $50,000 loan to hire a defense attorney. He pleaded with them, reminding Tasha that he was the golden child of the family and his medical career was their ultimate ticket to high society. He needed them to leverage Darnell's logistics business to save him. While Julian was busy begging his brother-in-law for a financial lifeline, I was sitting quietly at my mahogany desk doing exactly what I do best. I was following the money. When Darnell first launched his so-called logistics company 3 years ago, his credit was just as abysmal as Julian's. In a moment of misplaced familial support, I had co-signed on his primary business accounts to secure his initial line of credit. Because my name was still legally attached to those specific accounts as a guarantor, I retained full administrative access to his banking portals. I had already frozen the credit cards, but I had not yet taken a deep dive into the actual ledgers. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, cracked my knuckles, and opened the financial auditing software on my dual monitors. It did not take a forensic genius to spot the glaring irregularities in Darnell's bookkeeping. For a man who constantly claimed his business was struggling due to a tough economy, there was an astonishing amount of liquid capital flowing out of his accounts. I began pulling the monthly statements from the past 2 years, categorizing every single line item. I noticed a highly consistent pattern of wire transfers being sent on the first of every month to a luxury residential leasing management company in Midtown Atlanta. The transfers were listed under vague expense categories like warehouse storage and vendor fulfillment. I cross-referenced the management company's tax ID and pulled the public property records. Darnell was not leasing a warehouse. He was leasing a 2-bedroom luxury apartment. I dug deeper, my eyes scanning the endless rows of data. Interspersed between legitimate business expenses were massive cash withdrawals and recurring charges at high-end boutiques, expensive steakhouses, and a luxury car dealership. I knew for a fact Tasha was not receiving these gifts. Tasha complained endlessly at family dinners that Darnell never took her anywhere nice anymore because he was supposedly reinvesting all his profits back into the company. I tracked the utilities for the Midtown apartment. They were paid through the business account, but registered under the name Kiera Washington. Darnell was not just a failing businessman. He was systematically siphoning tens of thousands of dollars from his company to fully fund a secret life and a secret mistress, completely bankrupting his legitimate business in the process. He had been using the credit lines I guaranteed to pay for his wife's illusion of wealth while spending the actual cash on Kiera. I felt a cold, sharp smile spread across my face. I highlighted every fraudulent transaction, every wire transfer, and every jewelry receipt. I compiled the evidence meticulously. I printed the damning financial statements on premium heavy stock paper. I organized them chronologically, added colorful forensic summary tabs for easy reading, and placed the entire devastating report into a beautifully embossed leather binder. It was a masterpiece of financial destruction. I knew exactly where Tasha would be on a Thursday afternoon. Regardless of her husband's failing business, Tasha strictly maintained her image. Every Thursday at 2 o'clock, she held court at an exclusive, wildly expensive salon in the wealthy Buckhead district. It was where she went to gossip, network with other former sorority sisters, and pretend she was part of Atlanta's elite upper echelon. I left my office and drove my rental car across town. I walked into the salon right at 3 o'clock. The air was thick with the smell of expensive hair products and the loud chatter of wealthy women. Tasha was sitting in the center stylist chair, a silk cape draped over her shoulders, loudly regaling the women around her with the fabricated story of how I had gone crazy and tried to ruin her brother's graduation. She paused mid-sentence when she saw me standing in the doorway. The salon went completely quiet. The other women, recognizing me from Tasha's malicious stories, turned to stare. Tasha recovered quickly, her lips curling into a nasty, condescending sneer. She looked me up and down, taking in my tailored suit, and decided to play to her audience. "Well, look who it is," Tasha announced loudly, her voice dripping with venom. "I am surprised they let you in here, Chloe. This is a high-end salon. They do not specialize in fixing your kind of nappy, unkempt hair. Maybe you should take your bitter, dark-skinned energy back to the discount beauty supply store where you belong. We only cater to actual pedigree here." A few of her sycophantic friends snickered. Tasha was playing her favorite card, leaning heavily into the toxic colorism her mother had taught her. She expected me to shrink, to feel embarrassed, to run away crying from the public humiliation. I did not blink. I walked slowly across the pristine white tile floor, my heels clicking sharply with every step. I stopped right next to her chair. I looked at the stylist, who was holding a pair of shears, completely frozen in shock. Then I looked down at Tasha. "Hello, Tasha. I said, my voice eerily calm and pleasant. I am not here for a blowout. I just came to deliver some urgent reading material. I know you and Darnell have been frantically trying to figure out where you are going to find $50,000 to save Julian from federal prison. I thought this might help clarify your financial situation. I held out the beautiful leather binder. Tasha stared at it suspiciously, refusing to take it. What is that? She demanded, crossing her arms under the silk cape. Another one of your fake legal threats. You are pathetic, Chloe. I gently placed the binder right onto her lap. It is an audited summary of Darnell's corporate accounts. For the last 24 months, I explained smoothly, projecting my voice so every single woman in the salon could hear me clearly. Since I am the primary guarantor on his credit lines, I did a routine audit today. You might want to look at tab 3. It details the $3,000 a month luxury apartment in Midtown he has been renting for a 23-year-old woman named Kiera. Tab 4 has the receipts for the Cartier bracelets he bought her in February. Interestingly, I remember you getting a cubic zirconia necklace from Amazon for Valentine's Day. Tasha's arrogant smirk vanished instantly. The color completely drained from her face. She looked down at the leather binder like it was a live explosive. Her hands began to tremble uncontrollably as she flipped open the cover. The salon was dead silent. Nobody was laughing now. Tasha stared at the premium paper, her eyes darting back and forth across the highlighted wire transfers and the undeniable utility bills. She saw the photographs of the receipts. She saw the undeniable proof that her entire perfect marriage, her wealthy sorority girl aesthetic, and her superior social standing were built on a humiliating lie. Her husband was not just broke, he was making a complete fool of her. No, Tasha whispered, a choked, desperate sound escaping her throat. No, this is fake. You fabricated this to get back at me. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice just enough to deliver the final blow. You know it is real, Tasha. You have known he was lying about the money for months. You just preferred to live in denial rather than lose your country club status. But the money is gone. He drained the accounts to play sugar daddy, and I just froze the credit lines he was using to keep you draped in designer labels. You are bankrupt. Tasha let out a loud, gut-wrenching sob. The illusion shattered completely. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably in the middle of the luxury salon, completely humiliated in front of the exact high society women she had spent years trying to impress. Her perfect life was disintegrating right before her eyes. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I straightened my posture, turned around, and walked toward the exit. Enjoy the reading material, ladies, I called over my shoulder. I stepped out into the warm Atlanta afternoon, taking a deep breath of fresh air. I had barely reached my rental car when my phone began to vibrate violently in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was Brenda. I pressed the answer button and held the phone to my ear, waiting. Chloe, Brenda screamed into the receiver, her voice completely unhinged, losing all of her usual church lady refinement. What are you doing? Tasha is having a hysterical breakdown. Julian is crying in my kitchen because his residency director suspended him pending an investigation. You are an evil, vindictive demon. You are destroying my family. I unlocked my car door, completely unbothered by her screaming. I am simply holding a mirror up to your family, Brenda, I replied coolly. You just hate the reflection. You listen to me, Brenda shrieked, her desperation peaking. You will not win this. Julian is marrying Sydney. Her father is the chief of surgery. Her family has millions of dollars. They are real money. They will pay off your petty little loan today, and they will crush your entire career. You are nothing but a dark-skinned peasant trying to play God. You hear me? We will crush you. I listened to her panting heavily on the other end of the line. She was clinging to her absolute last shred of hope. She genuinely believed that Sydney's wealthy family would sweep in and save her golden boy from the destruction he had caused. She thought the old alliances of high society would protect them from my wrath. I let out a slow, dark laugh that echoed in the quiet parking lot. I laughed until my chest ached, genuinely amused by her profound ignorance. Brenda, I said softly, my voice dripping with anticipation. You truly have absolutely no idea what I have sitting in my passenger seat. Call Sydney's father and ask for a handout if you want. But you might want to ask Julian how he paid for that engagement ring first. I hung up the phone, ending the call before she could respond, and got into my car. The war was far from over. I was just getting warmed up. I pulled out of the salon parking lot, my mind already shifting away from Tasha's public breakdown and focusing entirely on the next puzzle piece. Brenda's frantic phone call had actually provided me with a crucial piece of information. She had loudly bragged that Julian was marrying Sydney and that her wealthy family would protect him. But the undeniable reality of Atlanta high society was that entry into those elite circles required a massive upfront cover charge. I had seen the photographs of Sydney from the graduation night. I had specifically noticed the massive rock sitting on her left ring finger. It was a classic platinum set 3-carat Cartier diamond engagement ring. I knew the luxury jewelry market intimately well due to my high net worth clients. That specific ring retailed for absolutely no less than $80,000. Julian did not have $80,000. He did not even have $80. I managed every single aspect of his finances for 4 years. I knew his bank balances, his hidden credit card debt, and his non-existent savings. He was completely leveraged. So how exactly does a broke medical student purchase an $80,000 Cartier ring just weeks before graduation? I returned to my office and securely locked the heavy wooden door behind me. The afternoon sun was casting long golden shadows across my desk as I logged back into my secure forensic terminals. I needed to trace the sudden influx of cash. Criminals always leave a paper trail, and Julian was an incredibly sloppy criminal. He possessed the profound arrogance of a man who believed he was always the smartest person in the room. I started by running a comprehensive sweep of all his known financial profiles. Nothing new appeared. No sudden inheritances, no lottery winnings, and absolutely no approved personal loans. Traditional banking institutions had permanently blacklisted him due to his abysmal credit history. If traditional avenues were completely closed, he had to have used an alternative source of funding. I leaned back in my chair, tapping my pen thoughtfully against the mahogany desk. Where does a desperate man find $80,000 in liquid cash quickly? He borrows heavily against a hard, tangible asset. Julian did not personally own any hard assets, but his mother did. I pulled up the Fulton County Public Property Records portal and typed in Brenda's home address. Brenda lived in a modest but beautifully maintained brick home in a rapidly gentrifying historic neighborhood. She had inherited the property completely free and clear from her late husband over 2 decades ago. It was her only source of true financial stability. I scrolled through the digital property history, scanning the recorded deeds and tax assessments. Everything looked perfectly normal until I reached the very bottom of the page. A new document had been officially filed with the county clerk exactly 45 days ago. It was a second mortgage. A massive home equity line of credit had been aggressively taken out against Brenda's fully paid-off house. The principal amount of the loan was exactly $85,000. I clicked on the attached PDF file to closely examine the actual scanned documents. The loan was not originated by a reputable national bank. It was issued by a predatory subprime lending agency located in a rundown strip mall on the outskirts of the city. These specific types of lenders charged exorbitant interest rates and required minimal background checks. They aggressively targeted desperate individuals who needed fast cash and possessed significant home equity. I zoomed in on the final page of the loan agreement, focusing intensely on the signature line. There, printed in bright blue ink, was Brenda's looping cursive signature. But something was fundamentally wrong with it. I opened my digital archives and pulled up a copy of a catering contract Brenda had signed for a family reunion I hosted last year. I placed the 2 signatures side by side on my dual monitors. I am a highly trained forensic auditor. I spend my days identifying sophisticated financial discrepancies in forged corporate documents. The signature on the subprime mortgage document was a very good imitation, but it was an undeniable forgery. The slant of the letters was slightly too rigid. The pen pressure was entirely unnatural, indicating that someone had slowly traced the letters rather than signing them with natural fluid motion. Julian had committed federal wire fraud and severe real estate forgery. He had secretly taken out an $85,000 mortgage on his own mother's only home, explicitly forging her signature on the legal documents to secure the massive cash payout. He used that stolen money to buy Sydney's Cartier engagement ring and fund the extravagant illusion of his new elite lifestyle. He had callously gambled his mother's entire financial future on the arrogant assumption that once he became a wealthy surgeon, he could quietly pay off the predatory loan before Brenda ever noticed the monthly statements arriving in the mail. It was a level of narcissistic sociopathy that even I had not fully anticipated. The sheer audacity required to legally risk the roof over his own mother's head simply to impress a wealthy woman was absolutely staggering. I sat in the quiet of my office staring at the forged signature, feeling a cold wave of absolute clarity wash over me. Julian had unwittingly handed me the ultimate weapon of his own destruction. He thought he was playing a sophisticated game of high society chess, but he had just handed me the nuclear launch codes. I did not immediately call the local police. Sending Julian to jail right now would be too quick, too easy, and far too private. He had humiliated me in front of hundreds of people. I intended to return the favor with severe compounding interest. Furthermore, simply exposing the fraud would not give me the absolute control I intensely desired over the entire situation. I needed to personally own the consequences of his failure. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct number for a private contact I frequently utilized in the distressed debt acquisition market. Subprime lenders are notoriously greedy and exceptionally risk-averse when it comes to high-profile legal litigation. They sell off questionable debt portfolios constantly to maintain operational liquidity. I instructed my broker to immediately contact the strip mall lending agency holding Brenda's forged mortgage. I fully authorized Apex Financial Holdings LLC to aggressively purchase the entire $85,000 debt for a slight premium in cold hard cash. By 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon, the aggressive transaction was officially completed. The legal transfer documents were signed, sealed, and digitally delivered directly to my secure corporate server. I leaned back in my leather chair and let out a slow, satisfying breath. Julian had illegally forged a document to borrow money from a predatory lender. But now that exact predatory lender was me. I legally owned the mortgage on Brenda's house. I held the absolute power to initiate a brutal foreclosure the very second the loan defaulted. Thanks to Julian's extravagant spending habits, I knew for an absolute fact he did not have the cash to make the upcoming monthly payment. Despite the massive legal and financial threats currently hanging heavily over his head, Julian remained stubbornly delusional. He was relying entirely on the protective shield of Dr. Sterling's immense institutional influence. According to the mutual acquaintances who were still eagerly feeding me information, Julian had managed to somehow convince Sydney and her father that my corporate debt collection email was just a malicious fabrication created by a jealous ex-girlfriend. He spun a brilliant web of lies, assuring them that his non-existent lawyers were expertly handling the minor dispute and that I was completely unhinged. To boldly prove how completely unbothered he was by my legal threats, Julian and Sydney aggressively decided to move forward with their lavish engagement party scheduled for Saturday evening. They had expensively rented out the grand ballroom at the prestigious Atlanta Country Club. It was meticulously designed to be a massive, highly publicized social event aimed at permanently cementing their status as the city's newest elite medical power couple. Brenda was invited as the beloved guest of honor, completely oblivious to the terrifying reality that the expensive dress she would proudly wear was paid for by the stolen equity of the house she would very soon lose. They truly believed they were completely untouchable. They believed the thick velvet ropes of the country club would permanently protect them from the devastating consequences of their terrible actions. I stood in my bedroom meticulously preparing for the evening. I did not choose a delicate evening gown. I intentionally selected a heavy, custom-tailored charcoal gray power suit. I walked over to the mahogany desk and picked up a thick manila envelope containing the forged mortgage documents. I slid it carefully into my structured leather briefcase. It was finally time to aggressively crash a grand party. The drive to the Atlanta Country Club took less than 30 minutes, but it felt like the culmination of a lifetime of intense patience. I pulled my rental car up to the grand entrance where a long line of luxury vehicles was already waiting for the valet service. The country club was a sprawling historic estate of manicured lawns and towering oak trees draped beautifully in elegant white fairy lights. It was the absolute pinnacle of high society exclusivity in the city. I stepped out of the car, handing the keys to a young valet who looked slightly intimidated by my tailored charcoal gray power suit. I did not look like a woman arriving to celebrate a joyful union. I looked like a corporate executive arriving to finalize a hostile corporate takeover. I bypassed the main reception line and slipped quietly through a side entrance I knew well from auditing the club's financial records a few years prior. The grand ballroom was a breathtaking spectacle of excessive wealth and calculated pretense. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over 200 of the city's most influential residents. There were prominent church elders dressed in their expensive Sunday best, mingling easily with hospital board members in sharp-tailored tuxedos. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated smoothly with silver trays of premium champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. A live jazz quartet played softly in the corner, providing the perfect sophisticated soundtrack for the massive illusion Julian had so carefully constructed. I found a quiet, shadowed alcove near the massive arched windows that offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the elevated head table. Seated at the very center of the room like absolute royalty was Brenda. She was wearing an extravagant floor-length emerald green gown that practically screamed new money. She was holding court surrounded by members of the Greater Zion Church congregation who hung eagerly on her every word. I could clearly hear her shrill voice carrying over the gentle jazz music. She was loudly bragging to a group of deaconesses about her brilliant son, the doctor, and the incredible pedigree of his beautiful new fiancé. She pointed proudly toward the polished dance floor where Julian and Sydney were swaying softly to the music. Julian was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that I knew for an absolute fact he had charged to a now-canceled credit card. Sydney looked radiant, her hand resting conspicuously on his shoulder, so the massive 3-carat Cartier diamond caught the bright chandelier light. They looked like the flawless elite couple they so desperately wanted to be. It was almost a shame to destroy the beautiful painting they had meticulously created. I caught the attention of a passing waiter. He was a young man looking slightly overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the opulent event. I discreetly handed him a folded, crisp $500 bill. His eyes widened significantly as he looked down at the massive amount of money and then back up at my stoic expression. "I need a very specific favor," I said quietly, keeping my voice perfectly level and authoritative. I reached into my structured leather briefcase and pulled out the thick manila envelope containing the forged mortgage documents and the severe default notices. I also pulled out a small red square box. It was a genuine Cartier ring box that I had kept from a previous wealthy client gift, but it was completely empty inside. "Place these items securely on a silver serving platter," I instructed the waiter. "You are going to walk directly to the main head table right now. You will present this platter exclusively to Dr. Richard Sterling, the chief of surgery. Do not hand it to anyone else at the table. Just place it directly in front of him. Say it is a special urgent delivery from Apex Financial and walk away immediately without answering any questions." The young waiter nodded quickly, pocketing the $500 bill into his apron. I watched closely from the shadows as he walked briskly toward the main catering station. A moment later, he emerged carrying a highly polished silver-domed platter. He navigated smoothly through the crowded, elegant ballroom, expertly dodging wealthy guests and dancing couples. The jazz quartet finished a beautiful song, and a smattering of polite applause rippled through the massive room. Julian and Sydney walked off the dance floor holding hands affectionately and took their prominent seats at the grand head table right next to Dr. Sterling and Brenda. The timing was absolutely impeccable. The waiter approached the table just as Dr. Sterling picked up his expensive crystal champagne flute to propose a toast to the happy couple. "Excuse me, sir," the waiter said loudly enough to command the immediate attention of everyone sitting at the long head table. "I have a special urgent delivery from Apex Financial." The waiter removed the silver dome, revealing the thick stack of legal documents and the iconic red Cartier box sitting perfectly on top. He placed the heavy platter directly in front of Dr. Sterling, bowed slightly, and quickly walked away, disappearing into the dense crowd, just as I had strictly instructed him to do. Dr. Sterling frowned heavily, looking down at the platter with deep confusion. Julian's charismatic smile faltered instantly. The blood completely drained from his face the very moment he heard the name Apex Financial. He immediately recognized the red jewelry box. He reached aggressively across the table in a sudden sheer panic, trying to grab the platter before anyone else could touch it. "Wait!" Julian stammered, his voice cracking slightly with terror. "That is a mistake. That is not for us." Dr. Sterling swiftly blocked Julian's hand with his own. He was a powerful man, accustomed to absolute authority, and he did not appreciate sudden interruptions or secretive, erratic behavior. He picked up the red Cartier box and popped it open. He stared silently at the empty velvet cushion inside. Then he picked up the thick stack of premium printed legal documents. Sydney leaned closely over her father's shoulder, looking deeply confused by the strange delivery. Brenda stopped her loud, boastful bragging and turned her full attention to the platter, an highly annoyed expression crossing her face. Dr. Sterling flipped open the first page of the detailed dossier. It was the official legal notice of immediate default on the $220,000 commercial student loan, meticulously detailing Julian's abysmal credit history and his complete lack of personal assets. Dr. Sterling's eyes narrowed dangerously as he read the undeniable certified proof that his future son-in-law was not a wealthy, successful prodigy, but a massive financial liability who had been entirely funded by a single corporate entity. He flipped sharply to the next section. There, in high-resolution color printing, was the forensic breakdown of the $85,000 subprime mortgage. "What exactly is that?" Richard Brenda asked, leaning aggressively across the table, trying to read the documents upside down. "Is it a surprise gift registry confirmation?" Dr. Sterling did not look at her. He slowly turned his head and glared at Julian with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. He tossed the mortgage document directly across the table so it landed right in front of Brenda's plate. "I highly suggest you ask your brilliant son, Brenda." Dr. Sterling said, his voice dangerously quiet, but carrying a terrifying immense weight. "Because according to this certified legal filing, your son just secretly mortgaged your entire house to a predatory lender to buy my daughter a diamond ring he could absolutely not afford. And the debt was just aggressively purchased by a hostile collection agency." Brenda looked down at the heavy paper. She picked it up, her manicured hands beginning to shake violently. She read the bold heading. She saw the recognizable name of the subprime lender. She saw the massive principal amount of $85,000. And then her eyes locked instantly onto the signature line at the bottom of the page. She stared at the blue ink tracing of her own name. The noisy ballroom seemed to fade entirely into the background. The surrounding guests closest to the head table had stopped talking, sensing the sudden aggressive shift in the atmosphere. Shocked whispers began to spread rapidly through the crowd as people noticed the chief of surgery glaring murderously at the guest of honor. "Julian, you did not." Brenda whispered, her voice trembling with absolute sheer terror. "Tell me this is a horrible fake. Tell me you did not put a massive financial lien on my home." Julian was sweating profusely, ruining his appearance. His charismatic facade had completely melted away, leaving behind a terrified, desperate boy caught in a massive, undeniable lie. "Mom, I can explain," he pleaded desperately, holding his hands up defensively. "I was going to pay it back as soon as my surgical residency started. I just needed the cash for the ring to secure the prestigious engagement. It was a temporary investment in my future. I forged it, but I was going to fix it immediately." He admitted it right there in front of the chief of surgery. He loudly admitted to committing federal wire fraud and real estate forgery. The silence that fell over the head table was absolutely deafening. Brenda's face twisted into an expression of sheer horrific realization. The home she had owned free and clear, the only security she had in the world, was completely gone. She was in active, brutal foreclosure because of the golden child she had worshipped. Brenda stood up so quickly her chair tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the polished hardwood floor. The sharp, violent noise echoed like a gunshot through the silent ballroom. 200 wealthy guests turned to stare. Without saying a single word, Brenda raised her hand and slapped Julian directly across the face with every ounce of strength she possessed. The physical crack of her palm against his cheek was incredibly loud. Julian stumbled backward, grabbing the edge of the table to keep from falling over. "You stole my house!" Brenda screamed at the top of her lungs, completely abandoning her refined church lady persona. "You forged my name and stole my house, you worthless boy. I am going to be homeless because of you." The entire country club was paralyzed in deep shock. Church elders gasped, covering their mouths in utter horror. Hospital board members murmured anxiously to one another, exchanging deeply concerned, furious glances. The spectacular engagement party had instantly transformed into a brutal public execution. Sydney stood up trembling with extreme humiliation and rage. She looked at Julian, who was holding his red, stinging cheek, and then looked at her powerful father. Dr. Sterling stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with menacing, absolute calm. He looked at Julian one final time. "The wedding is completely cancelled," Dr. Sterling announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "You are a complete disgrace to the medical profession, and you will never operate in my hospital. Come, Sydney. We are leaving right now." Julian reached out desperately, grabbing Sydney's arm. "Sydney, please, you have to listen to me," he begged. Sydney violently yanked her arm away. She picked up her full glass of premium red wine and threw the entire contents directly into Julian's face. The dark liquid splashed violently across his crisp white tuxedo shirt, ruining it instantly. "Do not ever speak to me again," Sydney hissed. She turned and marched swiftly out of the ballroom, closely followed by her furious father. Julian stood dripping with wine, completely destroyed. He wiped his stinging eyes and frantically scanned the silent, staring crowd. He was looking for the architect of his spectacular demise. His desperate, angry eyes finally locked onto me, standing calmly in the shadowed alcove by the windows. My arms were crossed and I was wearing a cold, victorious smirk. Julian let out a feral, loud scream of absolute rage. He lunged away from the head table, charging violently across the ballroom floor directly toward me, his fists clenched and his eyes wild with pure fury. He did not care about the wealthy audience anymore. He just wanted physical blood. I did not even flinch. Before he could close the distance, two massive men in dark suits stepped seamlessly out of the shadows directly in front of me. I had heavily hired private executive protection specifically for this exact moment. The lead bodyguard easily caught Julian by the shoulders, forcefully slamming him back onto the polished hardwood floor. Julian scrambled in the spilled wine, screaming my name as my security team formed an impenetrable wall of muscle and steel between us. I stood completely safely behind them, watching his entire future burn to ash. The Sunday morning following the disastrous engagement party dawned with heavy gray clouds matching the absolute devastation I had left in my wake. I knew Julian incredibly well, and I fully understood his psychological defense mechanisms. He possessed a terrifying ability to completely compartmentalize his massive failures. He would cling desperately to the single remaining pillar of his highly inflated ego, which was his newly minted medical degree. In his deeply narcissistic mind, the white coat was an impenetrable armor. He genuinely believed that once he officially walked through the sliding glass doors of Atlanta General Hospital and began his prestigious surgical residency, he would automatically be untouchable. He assumed he could charm his way back into Dr. Sterling's good graces, eventually win Sydney back, and use his massive future doctor salary to quickly settle his financial debts before the law ever caught up with him. He was relying entirely on the immense prestige of the medical profession to save him from the devastating consequences of his own criminal actions. He completely misunderstood the rigorous ethical foundation of that exact profession, and he severely underestimated my absolute commitment to finishing the war he had started. While Julian was busy ironing his pristine white scrubs on Monday morning, I was sitting in my corporate office executing my most lethal and final move. I did not just want to embarrass him. I wanted to permanently dismantle the weapon he had used to justify his arrogance. To do that, I needed to leverage the full devastating weight of the federal government. Wire fraud and real estate forgery are not minor civil disputes. They are severe federal felonies carrying mandatory prison sentences. I spent the early hours of the morning meticulously compiling a massive digital dossier. I included the verified forged mortgage documents, the predatory loan origination files, the detailed bank statements showing the aggressive transfer of $85,000, and the corresponding receipt from the Cartier boutique in Buckhead. I drafted a comprehensive, undeniable narrative of the entire fraudulent scheme. My first official submission went directly to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. But the final submission was the absolute kill shot. I sent the complete, unredacted dossier directly to the Georgia Composite Medical Board. The logic of the American medical licensing system is incredibly strict and entirely unforgiving. The general public trusts physicians with their lives, their highly sensitive medical data, and their unrestricted access to dangerous controlled substances. Because of this profound level of trust, the medical board maintains a zero-tolerance policy regarding severe moral turpitude. In the United States, you absolutely cannot obtain or maintain a legitimate medical license if you are actively under federal investigation for severe financial fraud and deliberate forgery. The ethical guidelines explicitly state that a physician who demonstrates such a catastrophic lack of integrity in their personal financial dealings poses an immediate, unacceptable risk to the public and the institution. A doctor who will willingly forge his own mother's signature to steal her home will absolutely falsify patient records, overbill insurance companies, or steal prescription medications. The governing board views financial crimes as a direct window into the fundamental character of the practitioner. By formally reporting his highly documented felony crimes, I was not merely getting him fired from a single hospital job. I was effectively triggering an automatic immediate suspension of his entire medical license across all 50 states. I hit send on the final email, completely sealing his fate. At exactly 8 o'clock that same morning, Julian confidently walked into the surgical residency lounge at Atlanta General Hospital. He poured himself a cup of premium hospital coffee, laughing loudly at a joke made by a fellow resident, and casually adjusting the shiny new stethoscope draped around his neck. He was basking in the sterile bright light of the hospital environment, drawing immense comfort from the respectful nods of passing medical students. He truly believed he had survived the storm. He believed that within the secure walls of the hospital he was no longer the broke fraud who had humiliated his mother, but was instead Dr. Julian, a man of incredible importance and high status. He even took the time to arrange his brand new customized pens in the breast pocket of his white coat, ensuring the embroidered letters of his name were perfectly visible to everyone in the room. He was actively building a new fantasy world right on top of the ashes of his old one. His pathetic illusion lasted exactly 45 minutes. The heavy wooden doors of the residency lounge suddenly swung open, completely silencing the casual morning chatter of the newly minted doctors. Two uniformed Atlanta police officers walked into the room, their hands resting firmly on their utility belts, their expressions incredibly serious. They were immediately flanked by the head of the hospital's legal counsel, a stern older woman carrying a thick, familiar manila folder. The casual, relaxed atmosphere of the lounge evaporated instantly, replaced by a thick, heavy tension. Every single resident stopped talking and stared at the doorway. The legal counsel scanned the room, her eyes locking directly onto Julian, who was frozen mid-sip of his coffee. "Dr. Julian!" she announced, her voice echoing sharply against the polished linoleum floor. "You need to come with us immediately. We require your absolute presence in the Chief Medical Officer's administrative suite right now." Julian slowly lowered his coffee cup, his hands trembling so violently that the brown liquid sloshed over the rim and stained his pristine white pants. He looked at the two armed police officers, and the remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. He tried desperately to muster his usual charismatic arrogance, but his voice cracked terribly when he spoke. "Is there some sort of minor problem with my orientation paperwork?" he asked, attempting a weak, highly desperate smile. "This is not an administrative orientation issue, Julian," the legal counsel replied coldly, speaking loudly enough for every single resident in the room to hear clearly. This is an active criminal investigation regarding severe federal wire fraud and felony forgery. Please carefully surrender your hospital pager and step away from your locker immediately. Julian was forcefully escorted out of the lounge, walking the long, sterile hospital corridor under the incredibly humiliating gaze of his brand-new peers. The nurses and attending physicians stopped what they were doing to watch the new surgical resident being marched down the hallway by law enforcement. He was paraded directly into the expansive glass-walled office of the hospital administration suite. Waiting for him inside was not just the legal team, but Dr. Richard Sterling, the powerful chief of surgery. Dr. Sterling looked absolutely murderous. Dr. Sterling had spent his weekend managing the massive social fallout of the ruined engagement party. Julian, the moment you confidently stepped into my hospital today, you became a massive legal liability to this entire esteemed institution. Dr. Sterling began, his voice dropping to a terrifying quiet register. I received an urgent priority notification from the State Medical Board exactly 20 minutes ago. They have officially received a highly documented, undeniable report detailing your federal real estate forgery. Julian gasped loudly, gripping the polished edge of the heavy mahogany conference table to keep his shaking knees from buckling completely. Sir, please. Julian begged, genuine tears finally spilling down his cheeks and dripping onto his scrubs. It is a massive misunderstanding. I can easily fix the money issue. I am a brilliant surgeon. You personally know my test scores. You know my clinical skills. You absolutely cannot let them take this away from me. I worked my entire life just to wear this white coat. You did not work for anything, boy. Dr. Sterling growled, stepping aggressively around the large desk. You maliciously manipulated and stole your way into that coat. The medical board has already initiated an emergency suspension of your provisional license. You are formally under active criminal investigation. The police officers standing right behind you are here to officially execute an active arrest warrant for felony fraud. The two police officers stepped forward simultaneously. One officer grabbed Julian's wrists forcefully, pulling them firmly behind his back, while the other officer retrieved a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. Julian let out a pathetic, whimpering sob, completely breaking down as the cold steel locked tightly around his wrists. Dr. Sterling stepped directly into Julian's personal space, his furious face mere inches away from the sobbing handcuffed man. He reached out with one swift, highly aggressive motion and forcefully grabbed the hospital identification badge securely clipped to Julian's chest. He yanked it violently downward, ripping the sturdy plastic clip completely off the fabric of the pristine white scrubs. You do not belong in this building, Dr. Sterling said, his voice entirely filled with absolute venom. You do not belong in this noble profession. You are officially terminated from this surgical residency program, effective immediately. And with the massive federal charges you are currently facing, you will never hold a medical license again. You are done in medicine, boy, everywhere. The news of Julian's highly public arrest spread through the Atlanta hospital network like a raging wildfire. By Tuesday morning, the criminal justice system had fully processed him, leaving him sitting in a cold holding cell, facing federal wire fraud charges. But the true devastation of his actions was currently unfolding across town in his mother's pristine living room. Brenda was sitting on her expensive velvet sofa, staring blankly at the thick stack of aggressive foreclosure notices delivered by registered mail. Her beautifully manicured hands trembled as she read the dense legal jargon. Because my holding company now legally owned the $85,000 subprime mortgage, the default was instantaneous. Because Julian had already missed the initial premium payment, the strict legal protocols were instantly triggered. The reality of her situation was exceptionally brutal. The only possible way Brenda could legally halt the aggressive foreclosure proceedings and save the beloved home she had owned for decades was to officially cooperate with the federal investigators. She had to formally swear under oath that her son forged her signature. She had to actively press criminal charges against her golden child. The profound irony was absolutely suffocating. For her entire life, Brenda had elevated Julian above everyone else, excusing his terrible behavior constantly. She had enabled his massive ego at every single turn, always blaming others for his obvious shortcomings. Now her only path to personal salvation required her to become the primary witness for his federal prosecution. She was forced to choose between the son she worshipped and the house she desperately loved. Desperate people always return to their perceived seats of power. For Brenda, that absolute center of power was the Greater Zion Church. She truly believed that if the cold legal system failed her, the wealthy congregation she had faithfully served and heavily manipulated for many years would surely step in to save her from financial ruin. On Wednesday evening, Brenda requested an emergency financial hearing with the elder board. She walked into the private fellowship hall wearing a modest black dress, fully prepared to play the ultimate victim. She intended to cry, quote scripture, and beg for an $85,000 church loan to save a faithful servant from a predatory corporate attack. What Brenda completely failed to realize was that I never leave loose ends. 2 days before her emergency meeting, I compiled a secondary digital dossier. I gathered clear screenshots of every single nasty colorist Facebook message Brenda had ever posted online. I meticulously documented her toxic gossip, her harsh judgment of poorer congregation members, and her vile racist comments regarding my dark skin in their private church groups. I combined those damning screenshots with the undeniable police reports detailing Julian's massive fraud. I emailed the entire comprehensive package directly to the senior pastor and every single member of the elder board. When Brenda stood at the heavy wooden podium and began to perform her tearful victim routine, the senior pastor simply raised his right hand, silencing her completely. He slid a thick printed copy of my dossier across the polished table. He looked at her with profound disappointment, his expression completely devoid of sympathy. He calmly informed her that the sacred church funds were strictly reserved for the genuinely unfortunate, not for families who actively commit federal fraud to buy luxury diamond rings. He read her cruel, colorist messages aloud in front of the entire governing board, forcing her to listen to her own toxic words. Brenda was entirely stripped of her fake holy armor. The church leadership formally asked her to immediately step down from all her prominent committee positions and suggested she seek deep spiritual counseling. She was completely ostracized from the only community that had ever given her a false sense of superiority. By Thursday afternoon, Brenda had absolutely nowhere else to turn. The harsh reality of her impending homelessness finally broke her stubborn pride. I was sitting at my executive desk, reviewing quarterly risk assessments, when my front desk assistant buzzed my internal line. She formally informed me that Brenda was waiting in the lobby, desperately demanding a brief meeting. I smiled, instructing my assistant to send her back. The older woman who walked into my corner office was completely unrecognizable from the arrogant matriarch who had smugly sipped expensive champagne at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel just a few days prior. Brenda looked physically exhausted, her shoulders heavily slumped and her eyes bright red from endless crying. Her hair was unkempt and she looked incredibly fragile. She did not bother sitting down in the plush leather guest chair. She stood nervously in front of my massive mahogany desk, wringing her hands together in a pathetic display of absolute defeat. "Chloe," she whispered, her voice trembling weakly in the quiet room. "I am begging you. Please stop the aggressive foreclosure. You have already destroyed Julian. He is currently facing years in a federal prison. His entire medical career is completely over. Is that not enough revenge for you? Please do not take my house. We are Black women, Chloe. We face enough severe cruelty out in this harsh world. We urgently need to stick together and lift each other up." The sheer audacity of her statement caused a cold, sharp laugh to escape my lips. I stood up slowly, leaning forward and resting my hands firmly on the polished wood of my desk. I stared directly into her tired, desperate eyes. "Do not ever attempt to weaponize our shared race to escape the severe consequences of your own terrible actions." "Brenda," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register, "do not dare stand in my pristine office and suddenly invoke the sacred sisterhood of Black women after you spent the last 4 years treating me exactly like the hired help." I walked around the large desk, closing the physical distance between us. "You never saw me as a sister." I continued, my words cutting through the quiet room like sharp broken glass. You saw me as a highly convenient automated teller machine. You happily ate the expensive holiday meals I generously bought you, gladly wore the designer clothes I purchased, and you eagerly traveled on the luxury vacations I completely funded with my hard work. But the entire time you were spending my hard-earned money, you were constantly making vile, degrading comments about my dark skin. You told Julian I was too incredibly dark to ever look elegant. You loudly proclaimed I lacked the proper pedigree for your magnificent family. You practically cheered when your son publicly humiliated me to chase a light-skinned woman with inherited generational wealth. You completely ignored my humanity because you thought my money gave you power. You only want to stick together right now because I am the one holding the heavy financial whip and your back is finally bleeding. Brenda flinched violently, large tears spilling quickly down her cheeks. Please, she sobbed loudly, unable to maintain eye contact. I was so incredibly wrong. I was foolish and completely blind. I will publicly apologize to you in front of the entire congregation. I will do whatever you want. Just please give me back the deed to my home. I crossed my arms, feeling absolutely nothing but profound, intense satisfaction. Your home currently belongs to Apex Financial Holdings, I stated coldly. Your brilliant son legally leveraged it, and I aggressively bought the debt. The aggressive foreclosure process is moving forward at maximum legal speed. Your only available option remains completely unchanged. To keep a roof over your head, you must formally cooperate with the federal prosecutors and press criminal forgery charges against Julian. You raised a narcissistic monster who financially sacrificed you to feed his own massive ego. Now you get to deal with the terrifying monster you proudly created. The meeting is officially over, Brenda. You can find your way out. Brenda stood frozen in the center of my office, completely paralyzed by the horrifying reality of her total destruction. She opened her mouth to plead one final time, but the sharp, sudden ringing of her cell phone interrupted her. The loud electronic chime violently pierced the heavy silence. She numbly reached into her worn leather purse and pulled out the phone. She stared at the glowing screen, her hand shaking so badly she could barely swipe to answer the call. It was Tasha. Because the office was incredibly quiet, I could clearly hear Tasha's frantic, screaming voice vibrating through the small speaker. "Mom," Tasha shrieked, her voice completely hysterical and breathless. "Mom, you have to help me right now. I just came home from my retail shift and the entire house is completely empty. Darnell is gone entirely. He packed all of his clothes, his expensive watches, and his golf clubs. I just checked the joint bank accounts online. He completely drained everything. He took the last $2,000 we had to our name. He left a handwritten note on the kitchen counter saying he refuses to stick around and deal with Chloe's aggressive debt collectors. He ran away with Kiara Mom. He completely abandoned me. I have absolutely no money, the rent is due tomorrow morning, and the bank is officially threatening to repossess my car. What am I going to do, Mom? Please tell me what to do." Brenda slowly lowered the phone away from her ear, the frantic, highly desperate sounds of her daughter's total financial ruin continuing to echo softly in the quiet room. She looked at me, her eyes completely hollow, finally understanding the true devastating magnitude of my calculated revenge. The golden son was heading to federal prison. The perfect daughter was entirely bankrupt and abandoned. The matriarch was mere days away from violent eviction. The family was entirely irreparably broken. 3 weeks after my final meeting with Brenda, the civil court date regarding the $220,000 debt arrived. The Fulton County Courthouse was a massive, imposing structure of gray stone and heavy mahogany. I walked into courtroom 4B alongside Marcus, my corporate litigator, feeling relaxed. Julian arrived 10 minutes late, projecting an aura of unearned confidence. Without his sister or his mother to financially bail him out, Julian was entirely broke. Rather than requesting a public defender, his narcissistic ego convinced him he did not need a lawyer. He believed that because he passed his medical board exams, he possessed an intellect far superior to anyone else in the room, including the presiding judge. He officially filed paperwork to represent himself pro se. He wore the exact same custom-tailored navy blue suit he had worn to his graduation party. He took his seat at the defendant table, arranging a disorganized stack of printed emails. When Judge Harrison called our case, Julian stood up and approached the podium with a condescending smile. "Your Honor," Julian began speaking in a loud, patronizing tone, "this entire lawsuit is frivolous. The plaintiff, Chloe, is simply a bitter ex-girlfriend. We were in a long-term romantic relationship. She voluntarily paid my medical school tuition as a standard gift. The contract her lawyers are presenting is completely unenforceable because it was signed under false pretenses. Furthermore, invoking a morality clause simply because of a minor domestic disagreement over an apartment lease is legally absurd. I save lives for a living. I should not be subjected to financial ruin over a romantic relationship." Judge Harrison stared at Julian over the rim of her reading glasses. She looked unimpressed by his arrogant speech. She turned her attention to Marcus, who was standing calmly beside me. Marcus simply approached the bench and handed the judge the leather-bound portfolio. "Your Honor," Marcus stated, projecting clear legal authority, "my client is Apex Financial Holdings, LLC. This was not a romantic gift. It was a strictly regulated commercial loan originated by a registered corporate entity. The defendant signed this legally binding contract, acknowledging the 9% interest rate and the severe default conditions. Tab 3 contains the certified police report proving the defendant committed federal perjury by filing a fraudulent emergency restraining order specifically to illegally seize corporate-owned real estate. That felony action directly triggered the morality clause, rendering the entire balance due." Julian scoffed loudly, leaning against the wooden podium. "That restraining order was a simple misunderstanding," he argued. "She is twisting the facts to ruin my medical career." Judge Harrison slammed her wooden gavel down sharply, cutting Julian off mid-sentence. "Mr. Julian," she said, her voice echoing loudly with absolute authority, "you are not currently in a hospital operating room. You are a defendant in a civil case, and your fundamental lack of basic legal comprehension is staggering." The judge briefly reviewed the highlighted documents. "I have spent 20 years on the bench." Judge Harrison continued, her tone dripping with severe reprimand. "I have rarely seen a defendant display such a spectacular combination of extreme arrogance and blatant dishonesty. You deliberately signed a commercial loan document with a registered holding company. You happily spent $220,000 of their capital. You then committed a documented act of perjury by filing a fraudulent legal document to illegally evict the managing director from her property. Your medical degree does not grant you magical immunity from contract law." Julian opened his mouth to argue, but the judge raised her hand, demanding immediate silence. "I am ruling entirely in favor of the plaintiff," Judge Harrison announced with devastating finality. "The commercial contract is legally sound and fully enforceable. The defendant is hereby ordered to immediately repay the entire outstanding balance. Furthermore, given the defendant's completely malicious behavior and obvious lack of financial liquidity, I am granting the plaintiff's request for maximum wage garnishment. Apex Financial Holdings is legally authorized to aggressively garnish up to 40% of any future wages you might ever earn across any profession. We are adjourned." The sharp crack of the gavel sounded like a heavy steel door slamming shut permanently on Julian's future. He stood completely frozen at the podium, his mouth hanging slightly open in sheer disbelief. He walked into the courtroom expecting his charm to effortlessly secure a victory. Instead, he had been brutally dismantled in 15 minutes. The judge had legally chained him to the massive debt for the rest of his entire natural life. Every single paycheck he ever earned would be instantly slashed. He would never experience the wealthy, lavish lifestyle he violently pursued. Marcus slowly closed his heavy briefcase with a satisfying click. We walked out of the courtroom, leaving Julian staring blankly at the empty bench. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of lightness. The financial aspect of my revenge was now officially sanctioned by the state. I walked into the wide marble hallway, expecting to head directly back to my office. But the universe had perfectly orchestrated one final spectacular moment of poetic justice. Julian pushed through the heavy wooden courtroom doors a few moments after us. He was violently muttering to himself, completely consumed by his civil defeat. He was so incredibly distracted that he did not notice the two tall men wearing dark gray suits waiting near the public elevators. They were plainclothes detectives from the Fulton County Financial Crimes Division. As Julian aggressively stormed toward the elevator bank, the two detectives stepped smoothly into his path, completely blocking his exit. Julian stopped abruptly, his arrogant scowl deepening. "Excuse me." Julian snapped impatiently, attempting to push past them. "Get out of my way." The taller detective reached into his breast pocket and calmly produced a shiny gold badge. "Julian," he asked, his voice strictly professional. Julian froze, his eyes darting frantically to the heavy metal badge. "Yes," he replied, dropping to a terrified whisper. "You are formally under arrest for severe felony wire fraud and real estate forgery," the detective stated, stepping forward and grabbing Julian's right arm. "You have the absolute right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you." Julian began to violently struggle, pulling his arm away in sheer absolute panic. "No, wait!" he shouted, his voice cracking loudly in the echoing marble hallway. "You cannot arrest me. I am a doctor. This is a massive mistake. My mother owns the house. It is a family dispute. She would never press criminal charges against me. You need to call her." The second detective grabbed Julian's left arm forcefully, spinning him around and aggressively pinning him against the cold marble wall. "We already spoke to your mother," the detective replied, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "Brenda came into the precinct yesterday afternoon. She officially provided a sworn recorded statement confirming you maliciously forged her signature on the subprime mortgage documents. She is the primary cooperating witness for your federal prosecution. You are going to prison." The profound, absolute irony of the moment was completely staggering. Julian had constantly relied on his mother to defend him, to protect him, and to aggressively attack me on his behalf. Now, in order to simply keep a roof over her head, the very woman who had enabled his massive narcissistic ego his entire life had firmly driven the final rusty nail directly into his coffin. Brenda finally chose her own survival over her golden child. The cold steel handcuffs clicked tightly, securely, locking around Julian's wrists. He slumped heavily against the marble wall, completely defeated. He was officially a convicted debtor and a highly documented federal criminal. He was violently handcuffed, wearing the exact same custom-tailored navy blue suit he had proudly worn to his graduation party. The detectives forcefully pulled Julian away from the wall, turning him toward the public elevators. As they marched him roughly down the long, brightly lit corridor, Julian slowly lifted his head. His terrified, tear-filled eyes found me standing quietly near the courtroom doors. He looked at me with an expression of absolute broken despair, silently begging for a tiny shred of mercy. I stood still, my hands resting calmly at my sides. I looked at the ruined man who had arrogantly told security to forcefully remove me from a party I had funded. I looked at the fraud who had happily allowed his mother to mock my dark skin. I tilted my head slightly and looked directly into his panicked eyes. I allowed a slow, cold, deeply satisfied smile to spread completely across my face. I gave him the exact same cruel, devastating smirk his mother Brenda had given me on the night of his graduation. The elevator doors opened automatically. The detective shoved Julian inside. He kept his eyes locked onto my face, staring at my smirk, until the metal doors slid shut, erasing him from my life forever. I honestly believed the sliding metal doors of that courthouse elevator would be the absolute last time I ever had to look at Julian. For 6 entire months, that assumption remained perfectly correct. The seasons changed, and the scorching Atlanta summer faded into a cool, damp autumn. During that time, the federal justice system moved with slow, devastating efficiency. Julian was eventually released on a highly restrictive bond while awaiting his formal criminal trial. However, his life as he knew it was completely obliterated. The state medical board did not hesitate. They formally and permanently revoked his provisional medical license. His expensive medical degree was now nothing more than a worthless piece of paper. He was legally barred from working in any healthcare facility, even as a basic administrative assistant, due to the severe nature of his financial fraud charges. Because of the massive civil judgment I had successfully secured against him, my legal team swiftly implemented the aggressive wage garnishment. Any legitimate income he generated was instantly intercepted and drastically reduced by 40%. To simply survive and pay the exorbitant hourly fees of his desperate defense attorneys, Julian was forced to take the only job that would hire a disgraced convicted fraudster, awaiting federal trial. He was working the late-night drive-through shift at a regional fast food chain. My own life had taken the exact opposite trajectory. The massive success of the Apex financial asset recovery had solidified my reputation within my firm. I was recently promoted to senior partner, and my compensation package reflected my new immense professional value. To properly celebrate a particularly lucrative corporate acquisition, I hosted a private dinner for my elite team at one of the most exclusive, highly rated steakhouses in downtown Atlanta. We spent the evening enjoying rare imported steaks and drinking vintage champagne. By the time the dinner concluded shortly before midnight, a heavy, relentless rainstorm had descended upon the city. The massive downpour created a thick curtain of water over the slick, dark streets. My private executive assistant had thoughtfully arranged for a luxury chauffeured car to wait for me at the private rear exit of the restaurant to avoid the chaotic, flooded main valet line. I stepped out from the warm, glowing interior of the restaurant and stood under the wide canvas awning covering the rear service alley. The cold autumn wind whipped the heavy rain sideways. I pulled my tailored cashmere coat tightly around my shoulders, waiting patiently for the black luxury sedan to pull up to the curb. The alley was dimly lit by a single flickering yellow street lamp. As I stood there checking the time on my diamond watch, the heavy metal door of the fast food restaurant directly adjacent to the steakhouse was suddenly kicked open. A tall figure stumbled out into the pouring rain, dragging two massive, leaking plastic trash bags. The person was wearing a hideous bright yellow polyester uniform polo shirt, heavily stained with dark cooking grease and smelling strongly of stale fryer oil. He wore a cheap plastic visor pulled low over his face and a flimsy, transparent rain poncho that was doing absolutely nothing to stop the freezing downpour. He aggressively heaved the heavy garbage bags into the large green industrial dumpster, letting out a loud, frustrated groan as the foul-smelling liquid splashed back onto his cheap, non-slip work shoes. He wiped the heavy rain and sweat from his face with the back of his greasy sleeve and turned around to walk back inside. As he turned, he froze entirely. The flickering yellow light of the street lamp illuminated my face, and it illuminated his. It was Julian. For several long, agonizing seconds, neither of us moved. The only sound in the dark alley was the loud, rhythmic pounding of the heavy rain against the concrete pavement. Julian stared at me, his eyes wide with absolute profound shock. He looked completely broken. He had lost significant weight, leaving his face looking gaunt and hollow. The arrogant, charismatic spark that had defined his entire existence was completely extinguished. He looked from my expensive, tailored cashmere coat and diamond jewelry down to his own grease-stained polyester uniform. The devastating contrast between our two lives was undeniably glaring. He was literally standing in garbage, while I was draped in extreme luxury. The sheer immense weight of his total humiliation finally broke whatever tiny, fragile remnants of pride he had left. Julian dropped to his knees right there in the flooded, filthy alley. The freezing, dirty rain soaked completely through his cheap uniform pants, but he did not care. He buried his face in his cold, trembling hands and began to sob violently. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was a loud, agonizing wail of pure, total despair echoing loudly over the intense noise of the relentless rainstorm. "Chloe," he gasped, his voice cracking and heavily distorted by his violent sobbing. "Chloe, please, please look at me. Look at what I have become." I stood perfectly still under the dry canvas awning, staring down at him with absolute cold detachment. I did not step out into the rain. I did not offer him a comforting hand. I simply watched him break apart. "I am so incredibly sorry," Julian cried heavily, lifting his wet, tear-streaked face to look at me. "I am sorry for everything I did to you. I was a complete monster. I lied to you. I manipulated you. I stole your money and I let my mother treat you like absolute garbage. I was so deeply intimidated by your massive success, Chloe. You were so incredibly brilliant and independent, and it made me feel like a weak, pathetic failure. I used Sydney and her wealthy family because I desperately wanted to feel powerful. I wanted to feel like I was the superior one. But it was all a massive, fake illusion. You were the only real, genuine thing in my entire life, and I viciously destroyed it. He crawled slightly forward, dragging his wet knees across the rough, dirty asphalt, until he was resting just inches away from the dry edge of the canvas awning. "Please, Chloe," he begged desperately, reaching a shaking, greasy hand out toward the hem of my pristine cashmere coat, but intelligently stopping just short of actually touching the expensive fabric. "I have lost absolutely everything. My mother will not even speak to me because she lost the house. I have no medical degree. I am facing 3 years in a federal prison. I am working 70 hours a week flipping greasy burgers just to pay my public defender because my private lawyer quit. But the wage garnishment is completely starving me. The state takes 40% of my minimum wage paycheck before I even see it. I cannot afford basic groceries. I am sleeping on a dirty mattress in a roach-infested studio apartment. Please, Chloe, I am begging you to call off your corporate lawyers. Stop the aggressive wage garnishment. Let me just keep my minimum wage. I am suffering so much. Please just forgive me." Society places a massive, incredibly toxic expectation on Black women. We are constantly conditioned to be the emotional mules for the entire world. We are heavily pressured to endlessly forgive the very men who violently break us down, to nurture them back to health, and to completely sacrifice our own hard-earned peace for the sake of their redemption. Julian was desperately relying on that exact toxic societal conditioning. He was banking on the faint hope that seeing him completely destroyed and weeping in the freezing rain would magically activate some hidden reserve of maternal sympathy deep inside me. He assumed my heart would soften, and I would grant him the undeserved grace he was currently begging for. He was absolutely wrong. I looked down at his pathetic weeping form and felt absolutely nothing but a deep, profound sense of justice. "Julian," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any emotional warmth. "You are not crying right now because you are genuinely remorseful for how cruelly you treated me. You are not apologizing because you suddenly developed a moral conscience. You are only crying because you completely lost the game you arrogantly started." Julian violently shook his head, sending heavy drops of dirty rainwater flying off his cheap plastic visor. "No, Chloe. I swear," he sobbed loudly. "I am truly sorry. I deeply regret everything." "You regret getting caught," I corrected him sharply, my tone cutting right through his pathetic lies. "If Dr. Sterling had not cared about the federal fraud, you would still be proudly wearing that white coat. If I had simply run away crying from the graduation party like you and your mother eagerly expected, you would be comfortably living in my luxury penthouse right now, completely laughing at my pain. You felt powerful when you publicly threw me out like common trash. You only feel sorry right now because I aggressively showed you what real absolute power actually looks like." I took a very slow, deliberate step back, ensuring my expensive designer shoes remained perfectly dry and completely clean. "I will never drop the legal wage garnishment, Julian. I will never call off my corporate lawyers. You signed a legally binding commercial contract, and you aggressively triggered the severe default clauses through your own malicious criminal actions. I am not your savior. I am simply the incredibly steep consequence of your massive narcissistic ego. Your apology is nothing more than a highly manipulative, desperate tactic from a completely defeated man, and I completely reject it." At that exact moment, the sleek black luxury chauffeured sedan finally pulled smoothly into the dark alley. The heavy tires splashed quietly through the deep puddles, stopping perfectly right in front of the canvas awning. The professional driver quickly stepped out of the warm, dry interior, instantly opening a large black umbrella to completely shield me from the harsh blowing rain. He respectfully opened the heavy rear passenger door, waiting silently for me to enter the luxurious vehicle. Julian stayed on his cold, wet knees, staring up at me with an expression of sheer, total hopelessness. He finally understood that there was absolutely no escape. There would be no magical forgiveness and no sudden redemption arc. He was permanently trapped in the miserable hell he had personally built. I paused right beside the open door of the warm luxury sedan. I looked back down at Julian, shivering violently in his grease-stained polyester uniform, surrounded by the foul-smelling garbage bags. "You told security I was just a roommate," I said, my voice ringing with cold, absolute finality over the heavy rain. "You were right, and it is time to pay your rent." I gracefully stepped into the pristine leather interior of the chauffeured car. The driver firmly shut the heavy door, instantly cutting off the sound of Julian's loud, agonizing sobs. As the luxury sedan smoothly pulled out of the dark, flooded alley, I did not look back out the tinted window. I poured myself a small glass of sparkling water from the chilled passenger console, perfectly content to leave him exactly where he truly belonged. The swift and brutal justice I served that cold autumn night in the rain-soaked alley was merely the final physical confrontation of my deeply chaotic past. The following months brought the absolute definitive resolution to the tragic comedy that was Julian and his deeply toxic family. The universe has an incredibly poetic way of balancing the scales when you finally stop allowing parasites to dictate your ultimate worth. Brenda, the once proud, arrogant matriarch who had constantly weaponized her perceived social standing, was violently unseated from her imagined throne. After the bank successfully finalized the aggressive foreclosure on her pristine brick home, she was forced to quickly relocate. She moved into a cramped single-bedroom apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood on the industrial outskirts of the city. She was completely stripped of her elegant garden, her sprawling living room, and the polished dining table where she used to entertain the wealthy church elders. The Greater Zion congregation, the very people she had ruthlessly sought to impress and manipulate, completely turned their backs on her. They viewed her highly publicized financial downfall and her exposed bigotry as a severe divine punishment for her profound hypocrisy and intense colorism. She spent her lonely days sitting by a tiny drafty window watching the heavy commercial traffic pass by, completely isolated from the vibrant community she once ruled with an iron fist. Tasha experienced a similarly devastating freefall from grace that completely shattered her entire worldview. When Darnell abruptly abandoned her to flee the state with his young mistress, he left behind a massive mountain of hidden debt that was legally tied to her name through their joint marital accounts. The perfect sorority girl facade violently crumbled into dust. To avoid aggressive collection agencies and the terrifying threat of immediate personal bankruptcy, Tasha was forced to abandon her expensive salon appointments and her exclusive country club lunches. She took on 2 grueling retail jobs, working brutal double shifts, folding clothes at a discount department store, and ringing up groceries at a local supermarket just to keep the lights on in a tiny rented duplex. Her perfectly manicured hands were now constantly cracked and blistered, serving as a harsh daily physical reminder of the fake wealthy lifestyle she had desperately tried to maintain at my financial expense. She was completely ignored by her former high society friends, who treated poverty like a highly contagious disease. As for Julian, the federal justice system finalized his complete and total destruction. After months of desperate legal maneuvering, his overworked public defender convinced him to take a strict plea deal to avoid a potential decade behind bars. Julian formally pleaded guilty to severe federal wire fraud and felony real estate forgery. He was officially sentenced to 3 full years in a federal white-collar prison, followed by 5 years of highly supervised probation and mandatory financial restitution. He permanently traded his pristine white medical coat for a standard-issue khaki prison uniform. He would spend the next 36 months confined to a small cinder-block cell surrounded by other disgraced, desperate men, completely stripped of his prestigious title, his fake wealth, and his massive, fragile ego. His grand, brilliant illusion was permanently shattered, leaving absolutely nothing but the cold, hard, undeniable reality of his own criminal actions. He had sacrificed his entire future just to briefly pretend he was better than me. While the people who had maliciously attempted to break me were drowning in the severe, terrifying consequences of their own toxic choices, I was rapidly ascending to entirely new heights of professional success. The managing partners at my forensic accounting firm had closely watched my brilliant, meticulous execution of the Apex financial asset recovery. They were deeply impressed by the ruthless efficiency, cold calculation, and flawless legal strategy I had utilized to completely dismantle Julian's life while keeping the firm entirely insulated from any collateral damage. David Reynolds personally called me into his expansive corner office the very week after Julian received his highly publicized criminal sentencing. He did not offer me a standard annual raise or a simple administrative title bump. He officially offered me a highly coveted seat at the massive mahogany table. I was formally promoted to senior partner, making me the youngest woman and the only Black woman to ever achieve that elite status in the long, prestigious history of the firm. I was given a massive equity stake in the company, a sprawling new corner office with floor-to-ceiling glass windows and absolute authority over the entire corporate risk assessment division. The very ruthlessness that Brenda had loudly condemned as an evil, bitter trait was the exact incredible skill set that secured my massive generational wealth. I had successfully turned their vicious personal betrayal into my ultimate professional triumph. To celebrate this incredible professional milestone, I decided to host an intimate, extravagant dinner party at my luxury penthouse. It was the exact same penthouse Julian had fraudulently attempted to steal from me, but the energy inside the sprawling space was now entirely different. I had hired a professional interior designer to completely erase any lingering traces of his pathetic existence. The heavy white leather furniture he loved was replaced with rich, warm velvet seating and beautiful, vibrant contemporary art that perfectly reflected my personal taste and cultural heritage. I hired a private executive chef to prepare a spectacular 5-course tasting menu paired perfectly with extremely rare vintage wines. But the most significant change was not the expensive decor or the high-end catering. It was the incredible quality of the people sitting around my massive dining table. There were absolutely no toxic family members whispering cruel insults. There were no arrogant leeches secretly calculating how to drain my bank accounts. I was completely surrounded by my true, chosen family. Marcus, my brilliant corporate litigator, sat at the head of the table laughing warmly, sharing stories of our courtroom victories. My close college friends, who had actively supported my tech startup dreams long before I ever met Julian, were raising their crystal glasses in my honor. Powerful female mentors, who had expertly guided me through the vicious corporate ranks, were sharing their brilliant wisdom and celebrating my promotion. The room was absolutely filled with genuine love, profound mutual respect, and incredibly authentic support. We were a powerful circle of highly successful individuals who actively celebrated each other's incredible wins without a single ounce of dark jealousy or hidden resentment. We did not need to tear each other down to feel important. As I sat at the head of my table watching the beautiful, joyful faces of the people who genuinely loved me, I reflected deeply on the profound journey that had brought me to this exact moment in time. For far too long, I had silently carried the massive, crushing weight of the black tax. It is a highly toxic, unspoken expectation, deeply ingrained in our culture, that strongly dictates successful Black women must automatically serve as the heavy financial and emotional mules for their struggling family members. We are constantly conditioned from a very young age to believe that our hard-earned success is not truly ours to simply enjoy. We are aggressively taught that we must constantly validate our worth by endlessly funding the dreams of arrogant men, supporting the fake lifestyles of jealous relatives, and absorbing the constant cruel disrespect of matriarchs who bitterly resent our fierce independence. We are expected to continuously pour from our own cups until we are completely empty and broken. I had allowed Julian and his family to heavily weaponize my own deep desire for genuine connection. I had falsely believed that if I just paid enough expensive bills, bought enough luxury gifts, and swallowed enough nasty insults, I could eventually purchase the true unconditional love I desperately craved. I thought my financial generosity would eventually cure their deep insecurities. But you absolutely cannot buy genuine respect from people who are fundamentally committed to misunderstanding your immense value. By finally severing those heavy, toxic financial ties, I had successfully broken a massive generational curse. I refused to let my incredible success be heavily penalized by their profound laziness and intense entitlement. I learned the incredibly hard way that true absolute self-worth requires a level of strict, brutal protection. You must be entirely willing to ruthlessly burn down the toxic tables where you are no longer being served respect. You must be willing to become the villain in their fake narratives in order to become the hero of your own actual life. The beautiful dinner party eventually wound down long after midnight. My wonderful guests offered their final warm hugs and sincere congratulations before taking the private elevator down to their waiting chauffeured cars. I locked the heavy electronic front door and walked slowly across the wide, polished hardwood floor of my silent, peaceful home. I poured myself one final small glass of premium reserve wine and walked out onto the expansive private terrace. The cold, crisp autumn night air felt incredibly refreshing against my skin. I walked over to the thick glass railing and looked out over the massive glowing skyline of downtown Atlanta. The towering modern skyscrapers glittered beautifully like diamonds against the dark, endless night sky. The sprawling city was a massive grid of endless, incredible possibilities, completely devoid of the heavy, suffocating shadows of my past. I took a slow, deep breath, tasting the clean, cool air. I thought about Brenda sitting alone in her tiny, dark apartment. I thought about Tasha folding cheap clothes for minimum wage under harsh fluorescent lights. I thought about Julian sitting on a thin mattress in a cold, dark prison cell. I felt absolutely zero guilt. I felt zero lingering regret. I was completely at peace with my necessary ruthlessness. I had fiercely protected my incredible life, my hard-earned money, and my beautiful, brilliant mind from the vicious parasites who tried to completely consume me. I had survived their massive, brutal betrayal, and I had violently conquered their fragile, pathetic world. I took a slow, satisfying sip of my expensive wine, smiling confidently into the quiet, dark night. I was absolutely ready for whatever incredible, beautiful challenge came next, knowing I would never let anyone dim my bright light ever again. I turn away from the dazzling city lights and step back inside my warm, vibrant penthouse. I walk over to the camera, looking directly into the lens, looking directly at you. You did not just stay for the dramatic revenge or the satisfying downfall of a toxic family. You stayed because some part of my personal journey intimately resonates deep within your own incredible spirit. You know what it feels like to be the dependable one, the strong one, the financial anchor for people who only view you as a convenient resource. You truly know the profoundly exhausting ache of pouring your heart, your time, and your hard-earned money into individuals who secretly resent your success. I am directly speaking to the women who have been conditioned to shrink themselves so the men around them can feel massive. I am speaking to the women who have been told that their value is tied to how much they can sacrifice for others. Listen to me very carefully. The ultimate lesson I learned from the wreckage of my relationship with Julian is incredibly simple, but violently hard to accept. Never dim your brilliant light to make a deeply insecure man feel comfortable in your shadow. And absolutely never empty your own bank account to build a foundation for a man who does not fundamentally respect the ground you walk on. We are constantly sold a dangerous romantic lie. We are falsely told that if we just financially support them enough, if we just blindly invest in their potential, they will eventually recognize our immense value and crown us as their queens. But potential is a highly treacherous, entirely empty currency. You cannot take potential to the bank, and you certainly cannot build a secure, peaceful life on a man's future promises when his present actions demonstrate nothing but profound disrespect. Julian did not want a partner. He wanted a wealthy, silent sponsor. Brenda did not want a daughter. She wanted a high-limit credit card attached to a woman she could easily manipulate and verbally abuse. They both wanted the luxurious fruits of my intense labor. But they completely despised the strong, dark-skinned tree that actually bore it. When you are a highly successful, intensely driven woman, your hard-earned success becomes a massive target. Toxic people will quickly try to guilt you into shrinking. They will eagerly consume your resources and then tell you that you lack pedigree or class. Do not ever let their deep-seated insecurities convince you that your hard-earned standards are somehow a character flaw. Your wealth, your intelligence, and your unyielding strength are not heavy burdens you need to apologize for. They are your beautiful, hard-won armor. When Julian stood on that stage at the Ritz-Carlton and demanded security, "Remove me," he thought he was humiliating me. He thought he was establishing his ultimate dominance, but he was actually doing me the greatest favor of my entire life. He was aggressively cutting the heavy toxic anchor that was dragging my spirit down to the ocean floor. Sometimes the universe has to forcefully remove the wrong people from your life because you are too loyal to walk away yourself. I was entirely too loyal to a man who was actively planning my financial and emotional execution. I had to learn that being unapologetically ruthless in the defense of my own peace is not a negative trait. It is an absolute survival requirement. You cannot negotiate with parasites. You must cut them off at the source. You must be willing to reclaim your assets, whether those assets are your financial investments, your precious time, or your mental health. You have to look at the people who are eagerly draining you and declare that the free ride is permanently over. If you are currently sitting in a relationship or a family dynamic where your immense value is being completely ignored while your resources are being rapidly depleted, I need you to wake up today. I need you to channel your inner auditor. Take a strict inventory of your life. Identify exactly who is building you up and who is ruthlessly tearing you down. Do not wait for a grand public betrayal to finally choose yourself. Do not wait until they have drained your savings and shattered your confidence. Step into your absolute power right now. Reclaim your territory. If you've ever had to repossess your life from people who thought they could use you, drop a comment below. I want to read your powerful stories. I want to see a massive community of strong, unapologetic people who refuse to be broken by toxic manipulation. Share your victories, share your boundaries, and let everyone know that you successfully took your power back. I walk over to the sleek marble kitchen island, leaving my empty wine glass far behind me. I reach into the chilled bucket and pull out a fresh, unopened bottle of premium vintage champagne. I expertly pop the cork, the sharp, celebratory sound echoing loudly through my beautiful, quiet penthouse. I pour the bubbling golden liquid into a heavy, sparkling crystal flute. I hold the heavy crystal glass up to the bright light, admiring the beautiful, brilliant reflection. It is a direct, intentional parallel to Brenda sipping her champagne on the night of Julian's graduation. But there is a massive fundamental difference. Brenda was sipping champagne paid for by my hard work, wearing a dress bought with my money, celebrating a son whose entire life was a fragile illusion I financed. I am sipping champagne that I bought with my own hard-earned money, standing completely secure in my own paid-off house, surrounded by my own untouchable peace. I raise the crystal glass directly toward the camera, offering a final, triumphant toast to every single person watching who has ever fought their way out of the darkness. My name is Chloe, and I didn't just dodge a bullet. I owned the gun. Thanks for listening to my entire story. Fade to black.